Hello, good afternoon, good evening, salam, shalom, wherever you are joining us from. We have participants from different parts of the world. It's really my great pleasure to welcome you here. This is our special event of Muslim Arts and Culture Festival, a book launch and discussion with Walter Ruby and Sabeeha Rehman. So we're launching this wonderful book. It's right here on my desk. I certainly enjoyed reading it enormously and a very great deal for it. My name is Yulia Yegorova. I'm based in the anthropology department at Durham University in the UK, where I also serve as the director of the Center for the Study of Jewish Culture, Society and Politics. So very warm welcome from the northeast of England. The topic of Jewish-Muslim interfaith and inter-community dialogue is very close to my research interests. It's very close to my heart, my personal interests, and it is certainly a very great pleasure and honor for me to have been invited to introduce this event. I'm certainly very thankful to MACFEST. My first very pleasant duty is to introduce Qaisra Shahraz MBE, who is the founder, the executive director of Muslim Arts and Culture Festival. She's a novelist, an award-winning gender and peace activist, and also a staunch interfaith champion promoting better relationships, including relationships between Jewish and Muslim communities. Over to you, Qaisra. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much, Julia. Welcome to MACFEST yourself. So, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Shalom, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I know that people from Indonesia will be joining us, wherever you're sitting in the world. Thank you all for joining us. We want to welcome you to our very final MACFEST 2021 event. And this time it's a special event. It's a book launch and a discussion with Walter Ruby and Sabeeha Khan joining us all the way from New York, and it's quite early for them, poor guys, 7:30 I think. And MACFEST mission, as many of you know who have followed us before, is to celebrate arts and to connect communities. And today we are celebrating books, and we are aiming to connect and promote positive relationship between Muslim and Jewish communities. Our aim is to break divisions and spread harmony and sweetness, as our slogan says, spread honey, not hate. As a trustee of the Manchester Muslim Jewish Forum, I have been championing this cause. Welcome, Sister Sabeeha and Walter. Many congratulations on your marvelous journey together in writing this amazing book. I'm so looking forward to listening to you both and learning more about this journey and the content of this book. Whilst I've had the pleasure of getting to know Sister Sabeeha lately, mashallah, and she's an amazing lady, I've also had the pleasure of knowing Walter for a long time. He's a dear friend, and we have worked together for several years as part of global season of twinning with the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding in New York, and he was the executive director at that time. As part of that initiative, I helped to organize events in schools, universities, synagogues and mosques, bringing Muslims and Jewish communities together. And that was one of the reasons Walter said, please, Qaisra, we want an event hosted by you on MACFEST platform. So a warm welcome to you both, mashallah. Also equally a really warm welcome to all our special guests, and they have all been well chosen, I'm telling you. We've taken a long time, but we've got a fantastic panelist list here, and I'm looking forward to listening to them. Also a really warm welcome to Rabbi Deborah, who is hosting this event, and we're delighted, Deborah, that you are joining us. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to Julie as well, who's become the face of MACFEST for us today, and for joining us all the way from Durham. So back to you, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed, Qaisra. It's really a great pleasure now for me to introduce Rabbi Deborah Bloston, who is a rabbi at Finchley Reform Synagogue in London, England, and was ordained by Leo Baeck College in the summer of 2020. Before entering the rabbinate, Rabbi Deborah Bloston read medicine at University College London, and she holds an MA in Education and Technology from the UCL Institute of Education. Deborah serves on the World Union for Progressive Judaism Executive Board and Youth Committee and has worked extensively in camp and synagogue youth and young adult engagement. She was named as one of Jewish News 30 Under 30 and the Jewish Chronicles One to Watch, and writes regularly in the Jewish press about issues related to progressive Judaism. Over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Yulia, and welcome all of you. Let me say something about how our time together is going to be spent. I'm going to begin, and perhaps it's telling about our speakers today, our authors today, that an event launching their book begins with the voices of others from different faith traditions, each of whom is going to speak for a short while, telling you something about them, their story, their encounter with this book, We Refuse to Be Enemies, written by our friends Walter and Sabeeha, who I'll introduce in due course. They will then follow this interfaith group onto our virtual stage, talk for a short while about their journey, their interwoven stories, and then it's for us to weave those stories together with ours, to enter into a conversation and to broaden our understanding of their lessons and think about how we might take on some of what they have to share. So to begin this welcoming process, I'm going to hand over first to the Reverend Dr. Nathan Eddy, who's the Interim Director of the Council of Christians and Jews. He's a United Reformed Church minister and has worked as a university chaplain, and he teaches Hebrew and Bible at the St. Mellitus College in London. So Nathan, will you take it away for us, please?
Sure. Well, thank you, Deborah, and thank you to Qaisra and to MACFEST in general. It's an honor to be here on behalf of the Council of Christians and Jews. I know I don't sound very British, but CCJ is a UK charity across the whole country, and I've lived in Manchester in particular. My children were born there, and it's terrific to be invited to MACFEST, and I hope we can continue this relationship. I've been invited to reflect very briefly, just for 3 minutes, on why Christians should read this book, and I think they should. I think it's a really important book, and I can well imagine local churches in the UK, as I would hope in the States as well, reading it. And primarily, I think it's so that Christians can understand and can promote solidarity and social cohesion in the UK or in the US, to stand with Muslim and Jewish sisters and brothers against Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all kinds of racism. And you don't need me to tell you, these have been in the headlines, even just this week in the UK. And Christians need to listen and to care about these issues and to find allegiances, alliances, as are described really well in this book through Walter's work and through Sabeeha's work as well. In the work they've done, you can read practically about how these alliances are built. In CCJ, for example, we've sought to create a twinning program, and I learned, Walter, from your program that you describe in the book. We're creating a twinning program between Black majority Christian congregations and synagogues. And the kind of local networks, local spaces that you describe are really, really important for the future of our democracies. I think another reason that Christians might be interested in reading this book is to get some critical distance about what it means to be a Christian, as well as an Englishman or woman, or Christian and Welsh or Scottish or British. I was really interested, a sort of sub-theme of the book is what it means to be Jewish and American or Muslim American. And I think that relationship between one's citizenship or nationality is one that Christians address differently in different ways, but especially it's one that not many Christians have thought about. For some Christians it is, but I think many more Christians, especially in decades to come, will be thinking through what it means, that relationship between one's faith or ethnic identity and nationality. And especially for Christians, what does it mean to be Christian in a pluralistic context? That also is a new question for a lot of Christians, not for all in the UK, but for many. And I think especially Christians, especially white Christians like me, have a huge amount to learn from Jews and Muslims, as well as people of color in general, about what that means when our faith interacts with being American or British or English. So that was a really fascinating sub-theme that I found. I have tons more to say. Perhaps we'll have a chance to chat through, but I really welcome this book. And on behalf of CCJ as well, it's terrific to have read this and to be here, and I look forward to our conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Nathan, as you were talking, people begun to introduce themselves in the chat. We can't see you as our audience today, but we'd love to meet you. So if you want to continue doing that as people introduce themselves and speak, that way we can build a fuller sense of who is in the room with us and what they bring with them. Going to go next to Afzal Khan, who's the MP for Gorton Manchester and a co-founder of the Muslim Jewish Forum. He's served as a Shadow Minister for Immigration, as Foreign Office Minister, and as the chair of the Labour Muslim Network. He was the first Muslim Lord Mayor of Manchester, and for his work he was being awarded both a CBE and also the highest civilian honour that can be given to somebody for his contribution to British-Pakistani relations. So, it's a hand over.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Deborah, for your kind words, and it's lovely to meet you here on this Zoom as well. I hope we meet up in London soon. And thank you to MACFEST for again doing an amazing work. I've been following most of their work in this 2021. It's been really helpful, especially knowing that we're going through this difficult patch of COVID-19, and using this technology to connect up the whole world has been amazing. So well done, Qaisra. Well, the book itself and the launch, I'm delighted to be here to meet Sabeeha Rehman. I'd already met Walters in the early introduction in Europe, in Brussels. But I think for me, at the heart of this message, we refuse to be enemies, is really looking from the history that, we come from Adam. In that sense, we share this one world we have, and we share this humanity. And then coming together as Abrahamic people, what is also more important is, more than half the world actually follows these three faiths. And therefore bringing the three faiths together, making this relationship stronger, having a better understanding, not to be enemies, that means there's a peace for the world as a whole. So that is important. But from a Muslim perspective, this idea of working and coming together on common good is deep. It's a command, that you come together on the common good. So whatever your faith, background, culture, or no faith, on the common good idea of a society is the command that we have to work together with one another. So more we see this, and the more you realize why you need to do this. And I think the day and age we are living in now, again, really pulls us towards that. Because if you can look at it from historical context, that, Adam idea, and then maybe a clan, a family, a village, a city, region, country. But now with the means we have of communication, the means we have to travel, it truly is a global village. We do connect with one another. And here in this Zoom today, you can see this. Different time zones have been pulled together, and we're sharing this. And that is what it's all about. And if I just borrow two examples from a Turkish proverbs ideas, and one of them is simply that civilization are almost like a river, and they go through different lands, but they connect up. And similarly, these ideas of civilization and our history, that actually we're connected, and we've all contributed. We all have a right to be proud of where we are, and we have a duty to work together. And then if you go into current situation of the climate and everything else, then again takes you to the same idea that we really need to be reaching out better and more. And the Muslim Jewish Forum, the Christian Muslim Forum, I was involved with setting up back in 2005. And we've seen, again, what happens when you do take a step towards one another. You actually get a better understanding of your own self, your own faith, and better understanding of others' faith. And through that, you also then understand the huge area of commonality that exists. I certainly have experienced that, being a founder of Muslim Jewish Forum Greater Manchester, and the amazing work this forum has been doing. Heather and Amin are currently the co-chairs, 135 plus events together. That again has shown all of us, how much commonality that we have. And the final bit which I wanted to share was, again, like I said, from a Turkish theme. And what they say is that never in the history of humanity, bad people have been in majority. It's always been the good people, always. So that's goodness idea is always big, it's huge. And those who are bad, they never have been bad the maximum time point of view. So all the time they're not being bad as well. So they too have good in it. So in a way, more reason why we should be reaching out towards one another, ensuring we have a better understanding. And MACFEST is doing an amazing job. And thank you for all those who have been participating. And I look forward to listening to our two guests who have written this book. So thank you, Rabbi Deborah.
Thank you so much. And I know this theme of common good and finding a shared language around common good is very present in the book, and we'll hear more about that later, I'm sure. Completing our trifecta, we have Esmond Rosen, who is the chair of the Barnet Multi-Faith Forum. He trained as a PE teacher, and he's had a long career in Jewish communal work, working within and also between communities. Latterly, he co-founded the Hartsmere Forum of Faiths, which is just north of London, and edited a volume about the stories of Muslims who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust. So, Esmond.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much for your warm introduction, and what a brilliant job you're doing at such short notice. And friends, shalom, salams, and peace. I'm delighted and honored to have been asked to be part of this wonderful book launch with such eminent speakers before me on a topic so close to my heart. We refuse to be enemies, or put it in the positive, how through face-to-face encounters and relationship building is the best way to begin to form lasting friendships. In synagogues around the world, and in my case last week at the Kotel in Yerushalayim, where my grandson Aaron was called up for his bar mitzvah Torah reading, this recites the life of Sarah, Abraham's wife, or more precisely, with negotiations and purchase of the land in Hebron for her burial place. He then makes arrangements for Isaac's marriage to Rebekah, his own remarriage, and his eventual funeral service. In my view, this biblical portion perfectly provides the central spiritual message replicated in this very important book. Beneath the surface of this Sedra is this midrash, a story written in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer and transcribed by the late great chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Lord Jonathan Sacks, Livrocha of sacred memory, whose first anniversary of his death was also last week, where there are three important clues waiting for us in the Torah text. The first occurs when Eliezer, Abraham's servant, is returning with Rebekah, who sees Isaac in the distance, and we're told that Isaac is coming from the way of Be'er Lahai Rei. The second is when, unexpectedly, once Isaac is married, Abraham marries a woman called Keturah and has 6 children with her. The third clue revealed in the Torah's description of Abraham's death is somewhat surprising presence of Ishmael at Abraham's funeral. The first clue is Be'er Lahai Rei, the place where Hagar, Hajjah in Islam, carrying Ishmael and fleeing from Sarah's wrath, encounters an angel who tells her to return to her homeland. Hagar names the place the well of the living one who sees me. The Midrash says that Isaac was there searching for Hagar because he said, "Shall I be married while my father lives alone? I will go and return Hagar to him." No. So what's the connection, and who was Keturah? The sages tell us she was indeed Hagar, so called because Keturah, her acts gave forth fragrance like incense, Keturet. The theory that Keturah was Hagar was also supported by Rashi, the celebrated 11th century rabbi and scholar. The Midrash continues to complete this challenging narrative. Hagar did not end her days as an outcast, and Ishmael and Abraham did not remain estranged. Hagar returned with Isaac's prompting to become Abraham's wife, and Ishmael and Abraham were ultimately reconciled when the two brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, stood side by side, reunited at their father's funeral. Beneath the surface of this narrative, the sages read clues and piece together a moving story of reconciliation between Abraham and Hajar on the one hand, Isaac and Ishmael on the other. The almost hidden narratives have immense consequences for our time. Jews and Muslims both trace their descent as the children of Abraham, Jews through Isaac, Muslims through Ishmael. Yes, there is conflict and separation, but that was the beginning, not the end. Between Judaism and Islam, there can be friendship, mutual respect, and peace. Abraham loved both his sons and was laid to rest by them both. This refusal to be enemies provides us all with a hope for the future, and for Walter and Sabeeha's book adds to a narrative which is not universally or usually heard. My own research at Yad Vashem provides the world with such a history of lost stories, of those not widely told, of brave and courageous Muslims who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust or Shoah, and who are honored at Yad Vashem as the righteous amongst the nations for their deeds. Both the Torah and the Quran speaks of saving one life is like saving the entire world. And these validated stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary deeds are ones in which we should all rejoice and celebrate, as they provide us, in the words of Lord Sachs, with the motivation and inspiration that will lead us, Muslim and Jews, and people of all faiths and goodwill, to honor life and faith and God, drawing strength from one another as we seek to build a world that is both holy and humane. Walter and Sabeeha, in honoring your work today together, we are recommitting ourselves even harder to repair the damaging fabrications of fear of the other, which is the real plague on our world as it so divides us. But by broadening our knowledge and awareness to do what is right, we can repair our torn planet. Those responsible for this impressive event have provided this space for us to ensure that these stories get their rightful place in our social media and educational worlds. And I send kol hakavod, congratulations and more strength to you all for this contribution and all that you have joined us today to make this world a better place. We will continue to work together to research and promote such stories, and so help enact the face-to-face encounters, build bridges of understanding between communities across the globe, that we need to make peace and friendship one step at a time. Thank you.
Thank you, Esmond, and thank you for rooting us in text. Some people talk about Jewish tradition as not a bloodline, but a text line. And I think there's something about our shared encounters with the texts that give our faith communities their sense of identity in the world. And in this, the interlinking and the ultimate redemption of Isaac and Ishmael. Maybe we'll return to how we use those stories to help us understand ourselves when we get to the Q&A. With the stage set, the welcome made, it's time for us to turn to Walter and Sabeeha, who are here to talk about their work, but really I think to talk about their journey and their friendship and what they've learnt by being in deep dialogue and sometimes difficult dialogue and engagement with each other. I'm not going to speak too much about you because I kind of want you to speak and for you to have the space to speak, and I don't want to tell your stories for you. But I will say this, that Sabeeha Rehman she's an author, a blogger and a speaker on the American Muslim experience. But she's not just a prolific writer. She takes her words into communities and uses them to start important conversations. She's given more than 250 talks in nearly 100 cities, and in doing so brought some of her warmth and openness and inspired through action as well as words. And Walter is a veteran activist in Muslim-Jewish relations. He's been the Muslim-Jewish Program Director at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. He began that role in 2008, and he now serves as the Executive Director of Jews and Muslim Allies Acting Together. And in between, he's written, he's connected, he's spoken, and even as we were warming up our panel today, what I could hear really were stories of sitting together, having meals in different cities around the world. the bits of your biography that involves names, titles, and places you can fill in. But really, I think introducing you through your actions might be the most important part of your introduction. I'm going to show you the book because I'm told it's important for you to know what the book looks like. I highly recommend it. Going to invite Walter and Sabeeha to be in dialogue with each other for about 20 minutes or so. Then I have a couple of questions for you to get us going. And then we'll invite our community, whether audience or panelist, to pose your own questions. I don't want you to sit on them for the next 20-something minutes plus. So if you do have a question, just put it in the chat. Imagine that it's everybody's dream in a faith-based event that the minute you put your hand up with a question or an observation, somebody comes to you and gives you the floor. The floor is yours the whole time and nobody's going to be offended if you interrupt. Use the chat, put your questions there. We will come back to them, make sure they get heard and weave them together so we have a real dialogue together today. You've heard enough from me. Sabeeha, Walter, this is your space.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, for that introduction. Thank you for moderating the event. Qaisra, thank you for inviting us and putting all this work into organizing this event. And listening to the panelists today, I have to acknowledge that it's moved me to tears. I am beyond, it's beyond comprehension. I'm very, very have a very warm feeling about this all. I grew up in Pakistan. In those years, I had never met a Jew. Pakistan is pro-Palestinian. To this day, Pakistan has not recognized Israel. So I grew up viewing all Jews through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, my father's passport was stamped all countries of the world except Israel. And that is literally and figuratively where I came from when I came to the United States in 1971. Walter, how about you? Had you ever met a Muslim?
No, I had not. Sabeeha, I never met a Muslim until well into my 20s. And I grew up a lonely Jewish child in a predominantly Gentile suburb of Pittsburgh. And I was moved by the book Exodus when I was a young kid, which came out, I think, in 1958. And then magically, my family had the opportunity to go to Israel for a year when I was 11 years old. I spent my 6th grade year there. My father had a sabbatical year at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. I fell deeply, deeply in love with the country. I felt really connected to my true self as a Jew for the first time, and it really transformed my life. But at that time, in my childhood year, I had no interactions with Palestinians at all, either Christians or Muslims. It wasn't until about 13 or 14 years later when I went back to Israel as a young, in my late 20s, and I spent 3 years there. And in that period, I was working as a journalist. I went out to the Arab villages, Israeli Arab villages, and I had intense encounters with Christians and Muslims. And I learned at that time the incredibly important power of face-to-face encounters, life-changing impact, and that in turn turning the other from a sinister abstraction into a friend and partner in work. So that became my life work. Sabeeha?
Yeah, so that's what it was like when we had our first encounters with the other. It changed our perceptions, and we both ended up engaging in interfaith dialogue, and we talk about those particular journeys and encounters in our book. I was a homemaker in the 1970s, chatting with my Orthodox Jewish neighbors by the sidewalk and exchanging notes on halal and kosher. And Walter, as he said, as a journalist, was interviewing Palestinians in Israel and connecting personally with Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And then in the early 2000s, he was bringing together imams and rabbis. We take you on our parallel journeys in our book as each of us shifted from being particularistic, celebrating our identities first and foremost, to embracing universalism and celebrating our shared humanity. And then one day in 2010, our paths crossed.
I was in the office volunteering at the American Society for Muslim Advancement when the phone rang. The gentleman at the other end introduced himself. This is Walter Ruby. I am the Muslim Jewish director at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. I was floored. An organization devoted just to Muslim-Jewish relationship building? Eventually, we started crossing paths in interfaith spaces, but neither of us had any idea where this relationship would lead us. It was in 2016 when my memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, was being published, and I thought that it would be good to have an endorsement by a rabbi. I thought of Walter. Walter is not a rabbi, but he worked for Rabbi Mark Schneier. So I emailed him. I was in Pakistan visiting family at the time. And I said, Walter, you know, I've written this book, and do you think that Rabbi Schneier would be willing to write a blurb? And Walter's appropriate response was, I have to read the book. I emailed him the manuscript, and this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on a Saturday reading the manuscript, writes back to me and says, Sabeeha, the rabbi will be happy to write a blurb, and I have an idea. I think the two of us should write a book together. Walter, why did you come up with that idea?
Well, two reasons, Sabeeha. First, I loved your book, Threading My Prayer Rug. It was just brilliantly written, funny, with very profound observations about the process of going from an immigrant to an American as a Muslim. So that was, you know, first of all, the thing was that I had been looking for some time for the appropriate Muslim co-author. I wanted to write a book with a Muslim co-author because I wanted to write a book about our Muslim-Jewish movement that had been building by that time for 10 years and share an account of its success because not enough people knew about it. Not enough people still know about it. So Sabeeha and I, but when Sabeeha and I met in the aftermath of the 2016 election, we realized that the book needed to be more than that. It needed to be, we felt, a kind of manifesto of why Muslim-Jewish alliance was so needed at a moment in history when both of our communities are threatened by the rise of bigotry and authoritarianism. As the two largest minority faith communities in America, we realized that we needed to stand together in support of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom, all of which make Muslim and Jewish life viable in America. At a time when both communities were at risk, we simply did not have the luxury to allow the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to drive us apart. Too much was at stake for all of us in America. So Sabeeha and I sat down to figure out what we wanted to say beyond that. And we also, we realized early on that we wanted to share 4 principles in our book, which we feel really inform all the work that we have done together, and we believe also the larger movement for Muslim-Jewish cooperation in America, in England, and in many other places. So here they are, very quickly. The first one is, if you save one life, it is as though you saved the world. And this is a central teaching in both the Quran and the Talmud, very, very central to our two faiths. And it really expresses very fundamentally, the preciousness of every single human life in Judaism and Islam. So that's an incredibly important commonality. But the thing was, is until I got involved in this work, I had no idea that that was in the Quran. Sabeeha had no idea it was in the Talmud. And I would venture to say that 90% plus of Jews have no idea it's in the Quran, and vice versa, Muslims about Jews. So this is an important example of a great commonality that we have that we just don't know about. We just don't know enough about each other, and knowing something this important is part of the way of coming together. That's the first point. The second one is welcome the stranger. Both the Torah and the Quran command this injunction in various ways throughout. Is a very important thing. In our book, we tell the story of our own mothers, both of whom were refugees, my mother fleeing from Nazi Germany to America, and Sabeeha's mother fleeing from India to make a home in the new state of Pakistan. my mother in the early 1940s, Sabeeha's mother, I guess, in 1947. What they endured, and what they endured is so similar to the ordeals of so many refugees, including Muslim refugees trying desperately to get to America, to England today to save their lives, and often, too often, stymied by bureaucratic indifference and bigotry. So that's the second principle. The third one we call Islah and Tikkun Olam. And both of these concepts, Islah meaning approximately reform, Tikkun Olam, repairing the world in Hebrew, they convey deeply the common moral imperative in both of our faiths to help those who are most in need. And we have worked together in our twinning programs, feeding hungry and homeless people, Muslims and Jews going out doing that together, visiting the sick, holding health fairs, many other things. And we share those stories of Muslims and Jews working side by side to realize that common moral imperative. Sabeeha, do you want to share the fourth one?
The fourth principle that unites us is standing up for each other. It was in February 2017 when Rabbi Jesse Olitsky and his colleagues marked the Sabbath by getting arrested after they sat down in the middle of the street in New York City protesting the Muslim travel ban. The rabbis spent the night in jail. Now, why would a group of rabbis subject themselves to a night in jail to protest a ban on Muslims? Because according to Rabbi Olitsky, we know all too well what happens when one faith does not stand up for the other. And then, not too much later, the tables were reversed. And now it was time for the Muslims to stand up for their fellow Jewish Americans. Tell us about it, Walter.
So the date was October 27th, 2018, just over 3 years ago. I woke up one morning, turned on CNN on a Sunday morning, and saw this horrific news that a neo-Nazi gunman had broken into the Tree of Life synagogue in my hometown of Pittsburgh and murdered 11 Jews at prayer. Nothing like this had ever happened in America before in the entire history of our country. And at that moment, I felt, my God, for the first time in my life, I don't feel safe as a Jew in America. A terrible, terrible feeling. And that so many were feeling across the country at the same moment. At that moment, though, I saw on the TV a group of Muslims in Muslim dress standing outside of the Tree of Life, waving placards expressing their love and solidarity with the people within. They were from the Islamic Society of Pittsburgh, and they had had a twinning relationship with the Tree of Life. And it was so, so powerful at that moment. They raised money. There was a national Muslim campaign that grew from that, fundraiser, which raised about $200,000 in less than 3 days. And then the following Shabbat, thousands came out to memorial services across the country in homage to the Tree of Life. Thousands of Christians and Muslims showed up at those events, many of them just coming spontaneously. And I was at an event at Temple Road of Shalom in Falls Church, Virginia. I was surrounded by Muslims in the hall where we were meeting, listening to the service. And I spontaneously hugged this young man standing next to me who had come with his 2 small children, a Muslim man. And I said, I'm so proud. It's so meaningful to me you're here. But let me ask you why you brought your kids. Weren't you concerned this would traumatize them? And he said, absolutely not. For me, when my brothers and sisters are under attack, I need to be there, and they need to be there too. They need to see this. This needs to be a life lesson for them. And it was a light in the darkness at a terrible, terrible moment. So so those are the 4 principles. And but it hasn't always been easy. There certainly have been moments where we've been set back, and oftentimes those moments revolve around what we call the 2 elephants in the room. The first elephant, the big, maybe the one everybody knows about, is the Israel-Palestine conflict. And we devote a chapter to dialoguing on the conflict in our book. What we've learned over the years is, even though we want to focus mostly on strengthening our relationship in America, because that's where we live, we can't brush the conflict under the rug. So we do talk about it, and we do dialogue. sometimes agree to disagree, agree. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree respectfully. We move on. We talk about it. And when there are conflicts like we've seen this year, it's important to pick up the phone and talk, not to avoid each other, as too often happens, where people just don't want to deal with it because it's too heavy. There's a second elephant which is less talked about, and we're going to get into it a little bit in this rest of our brief discussion here. One is called doctrines that in our respective holy books that offend the other, and there are many of those in both the Torah and the Quran. I wanted to say here that I felt when I read the Quran for the first time as a Jew, I felt I was a bit upset by how I saw the Jews presented in the Quran. It made me uncomfortable, and I felt that I just felt this kind of hectoring tone, a lot of angry condemning of the children of Israel. After they left Egypt, they're the sojourn in the desert. They, instead of when Moses comes down with the 10 Commandments, they're off worshiping the golden calf, and they're kind of hectored about that. Like, how could they be so ungrateful? How they were chosen, and look what happened. So I expressed. So what I did, it was when I read it, I called Muslim friends, I called Muslim scholars, I called imams, and I would say, what about this? And often they would say to me, but Walter, it says almost exactly the same thing in the Torah, the same condemnation from the prophets and others of how the children of Israel behaved at that time. So they were saying to me, well, if it says it in the Torah, why is it so upsetting if it says it in the Quran? And I said, and I had to think about it, and I thought, you know what, there's a lot of truth in that, and it comes down to my response, my upset response with the Quran comes down to this whole piece, part of human psychology, where it's okay to criticize your own, it's even okay to laugh at yourself. All groups have that, but if somebody else, God forbid, says the same thing, well, that's anti-Semitism, that's Islamophobia, that's racism, etc. So that was important. And again, it was about picking up the phone, having that conversation that helped me get past my feelings and move on. And then finally, Esmond gave a beautiful conversation on Sarah and Hagar, which was beautiful. It was a great table setter for what we're going to talk about, Esmond, here. So Sabeeha and I got into the Sarah Hagar parable also. And I told Sabeeha that one of the interesting things was that what bothered me in some level with this story and some others was what they call in Hollywood, location, location, location. So I had lived as a young man. As I said, I went to Israel as a young man. I was living at a absorption. My first home in Israel was in my second period in 1976 was in Beersheba, which is, as many of you know, in the Negev, and it is very, traditionally where suppose Abraham was with his flocks, and and so with Sarah, and that's where they came to, when they migrated from Mesopotamia. And so at that time, when I was a kid, I used to go out a young person, I used to go out in the desert, and I would go to the Bedouin tents that were just, right outside of Beersheba at that time, and be received warmly. And so it mattered to me. So my perception is when Sarah and Hagar, when Hagar was cast out with Ishmael into the desert, well, it was right there in Beersheba, but Sabeeha said, no, it was in Mecca. And so that led us to a kind of candid conversation. I said, that bothers me because that kind of disrupts my own historical narrative. And then, so that was an important thing. And it led us to a larger consideration of the Sarah Hagar story. Sabeeha?
And I said to Walter, this is the cornerstone of our faith, the location. We believe that the Quran is the word of God. And in the Quran, God says that the location was in Mecca. And God tells us in the Quran that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba there. That is the direction where Muslims face in prayer 5 times a day. That is the direction where God commanded us to face in our prayer 5 times a day. That is where God commanded us to go for pilgrimage to honor Prophet Abraham. And if we take into consideration that could Abraham have traveled from Hebron all the way to Mecca? Jerusalem is 920 miles from Mecca. And camels, which was the mode of transportation, camels can walk 120 miles a day, which if you do the math, makes it a 9-day journey. And we know from Abraham's history that he was a traveler. He traveled a lot more than just 920 miles. So, and then Walter said to me, Sabeeha, if I was a Muslim, I would be very upset at Sarah because she threw Hagar out with baby Ishmael. She compelled Abraham to take her away into the desert, leave her there alone. And I said to Walter, that's not our narrative. We don't believe that Sarah had anything to do with it. We believe that this was God's command. When Abraham left Hagar and baby Ishmael in the desert and turned to go, Hagar asked him, are you doing this because God commanded you to? He said, yes. She said, in that case, God will provide for us. So we revere Sarah. In fact, when my husband and I went to Hebron, we went to her site of her burial site. We raised our hands and said the Fatiha, a prayer for her. We name our daughters Sarah. My husband's niece is named Sarah. So it's a very, she is revered in our faith. And so Walter said, well, let's drink to that. We can finally put the Sarah and Hagar conflict to rest. And I said, yes, I'll drink to that, non-alcoholic for me. In this journey, Walter and I have learned a few lessons that we feel can be applied in any context, in any time and place. We can apply that in the United States. We can apply those in the UK or anywhere else for that matter. Because we are not in a position to resolve the conflict, but we are in a position to do a whole lot. So the first lesson we learned was we as Americans, we are Americans first. And whereas the Palestinian-Israeli conflict matters deeply to us, we have to put ahead of that our concerns for pluralism in our society and for democracy. We saw what happened on January 6th in the United States, and I see that as a prologue of worse days to come. And unless Muslims and Jews and people of faiths unite together, minority faiths will be at a very, very, at a disadvantage should things go south. Number two, we must stay engaged and speak up and work together against injustice, both at home and abroad. Number three, Muslims should support the work of NGOs in Israel and Palestine that are working to improve the conditions on the ground and save lives. Walter is involved in Project Rosanna, which is a project which brings Palestinian children who are suffering from cancer, need dialysis, daily across the border into Israel to receive medical treatment and bring them back. Activities like these. Number four, allow others to speak up, whether we agree with them or not. Here in the US, Representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib have said things that have hurt the sensitivities of the American Jews, but they have as much of a right to speak up, to advocate for Palestinians in the halls of Congress as do Jewish members of Congress like Senator Schumer and Ben Cardin, who have a right to speak up for Israel. Number five, don't allow Israel-Palestine to be weaponized in ways that drive our communities apart. One example is former President Trump saying, go back to where you came from. Number six, let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. activists like Linda Sarsour have correctly demanded that they be allowed to speak up freely as proud Palestinian Americans, but we disagree when Zionists are demonized. And then number 7, Muslims should engage with mainstream American Jews who consider themselves Zionists rather than allying themselves exclusively with anti-Zionist groups. Similarly, Jewish communities should get involved on causes that are common to both communities, work together with them, even where we disagree on Israel and Palestine, but where we can come together on issues like racial justice, like inequality, that are important to both of us. And finally, let's be cautious about labeling one another as anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. We acknowledge the sensitivities in both communities. Criticizing Israel's policies and its leaders is just that. It is a criticism of the policies and the leaders. It is not a criticism of all Jews. Likewise, being critical of the leaders of Muslim countries and their policies is not Islamophobia. Yet, we need to be keenly aware of the sensitivities on both sides so that our comments are not perceived to be Islamophobic or anti-Semitic, particularly if it was not meant to be as such. And with that, we bring our presentation to a close. Thank you for listening. And Rabbi, we are ready for your questions.
Thank you so much for a really lovely tour of your book in so many ways. So you've managed to really bring to the surface some of the key points, but also leave us wanting more. So I hope for those who are sitting here thinking, how did they get here? I really encourage you to take a moment and read the long form version of the conversation that's been had today. I do have some questions for you. Your book is a deeply American story. And the idea of America is very present in your conversations about your own identity and in how you situate it in current affairs today. You published just as Biden was about to come into office. Have you seen any changes? How are you feeling in this world that's kind of a year on since the election?
Thank you, Deborah, for that question. Speaking for myself, I feel that whereas during the Trump era, the darkness brought the communities together, brought the Muslim and Jewish communities together, and other communities, Christian communities as well. Trumpism prevails. It is still there. Bigotry is still there. And Islamophobia is still there. Anti-Semitism is still there. It is not as open as it was during the Trump era, but now we know that it's there because we saw it manifested itself. And it will take very little for those attacks to start all over again. So our work is not done. Just getting Biden into office will not solve this problem. There's a lot of work that we have to continue to do on the ground, to continue to bring people together, to develop understanding, to make sure that we not only have the laws in place that provide us with security, but we also have to win the hearts and minds of people. The laws can only go so far, but it is the people on the ground winning their hearts and minds that makes all the difference. And we have to continue to do that, continue to reach out, talk to people, and foster not only understanding, but warmth, and create interdependency. Walter, would you like to add to that?
No, I basically agree with everything you've said, Sabeeha. I think we weren't sanguine, but we did think that the change would in administrations would I think move things in a very positive direction. And the evidence at this point is mixed, as you probably just saw in the elections the other day in America. So we have to stay with this. I think that I think part of it is the interfaith community really needs to be very strong in defending pluralism, democracy, human rights, and religious freedom. The Muslim and Jewish communities are a big part of that, as the two, as I said, the two largest minority faith communities. So if America is going to be a place where multiple religions, multiple faiths are able to be free and open and express themselves and live out their faiths vibrantly, we have to stand up for these values. And but obviously, again, as Nathan pointed out, together with the Christian community, together with the larger interfaith community. So it's both Muslims and Jews working together, not allowing, again, Israel-Palestine to tear us apart to the point where we can't work together effectively, and at the same time working in solidarity with the larger interfaith community.
People often say religion and politics don't mix, or are not easy fellows. Something I was struck by reading Walter, a lot of the way you talk about your own activism situates you on the left of the Israel conversation. The way that you've talked about Biden, again, there's a sense of left, right. I'm wondering what does framing it as religious communities do to the conversation of the kind of left-right polarization? If you live in a society that's quite polarized around political identity, can an overarching religious identity help people cross out of their silos?
Well, I think so, and you're pointing to an irony, Deborah, that traditionally religions seem to be more of a flashpoint or a thing that would drive people apart, maybe than politics or political discourse. At least it was like that in our country. Well, I think we not only our country, but Europe, obviously, with religious wars for 2,000 years and all of that. At this point, in some ways, it is easier and maybe more felicitous, or a very important thing to do to build interfaith ties, and Muslim-Jewish ties as a very important piece of that, because we are really struggling with the political discourse of just trying to find a way to, and I've been involved in some of those efforts to reach across the political divide, and not very successfully, because it is very hard to find common ground as to whether the election was stolen or not. So we're struggling with that. We can't put it aside. It's very, very important. And just to go back to your first point, in terms of my own politics, I am who I am, but I feel it's very, very important to work with people from many different perspectives. People who may be on the Israel Jewish vector, perhaps more centrist than me, but absolutely they're also a big part of what we do, which is why Sabeeha emphasized that point, that we can't just be having a dialogue of the anti-Zionist left and the Muslims. That's a big mistake. We have to have the whole Jewish community involved, and we have to have as much of the Muslim community involved across the lines too. So it's a constant challenge, but that's what we're trying to do.
Sabeeha, do you want to come in?
I'm on the same page as Walter, so totally in agreement.
So let's go back to your same pages then, particularly your lessons learned. One that really struck me was your point 7 about talking to people who maybe are less comfortable dialogue partners. I remember an organizer working with our community saying, the perfect partner does not exist. And yet in your book, you gave examples of pressure to work or not work with different groups. For instance, Eric Yoffe in the URJ, who seems to pull back from working with particular Muslim groups. It's an experience we have quite often in the UK, where people pull out of events because somebody discovers a piece of information about somebody else on a panel. In Jewish-Muslim dialogue, that's often to do with relationships with Israel or relationships with charities that do work in Gaza or in the occupied Palestinian territories. The perfect partner does not exist. And yet everybody wants it. What would you say to people who are holding that tension in their communities? How would you encourage them to move forward?
Thank you. Yeah, that is something that we have been struggling with a lot. And I'll answer your question first, and then I'll tell you why how we are struggling with it. But the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, as one example, which is a group of Muslim and Jewish women coming together to overcome bigotry and hatred, have started doing webinars to train participants on not just conflict resolution, but how to facilitate difficult discussions so that we enter into a dialogue with an intent to listen, to hear the other person out, to make everybody in the room feel that they are being heard, but not come into the discussion with the intention of changing minds or changing positions or establishing which side is right and which side is wrong. Just hear the other person's perspective. But there are tools and techniques to doing that. And I would suggest that if there are, depending on who is engaged in the discussion and how strongly they feel about their position, that you may want to have a trained facilitator to guide that discussion so that nobody leaves the room and so that relationships do not fall apart. And now I'll offer some context. In the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, we had guidelines, and those were that once a chapter is established, you will not engage in politics for the first 18 months. Give it time for relationships and trust to develop. So after the first 18 months, we still didn't talk about it. Another 18 months went by, we still didn't talk about it because things were going so well that nobody wanted to ruffle anyone's feathers. But then 2 years ago, a committee was formed that now it is time that we do talk about it and let's figure out how we're going to do it. This year, when the conflict broke out, some of the chapters did attempt to talk about it. In some cases, it worked. In some cases, the chapters had to go on hiatus. In the sisterhood, some Jewish people left, some Muslim people left. The Jewish women left because they felt that the organization was too pro-Palestinian. The Muslim women left because they felt that the Jewish women had been silent and had not spoken up enough. So it is a work in progress. And I can't say that we have an answer that will apply in every circumstance. It's something we are working on.
Yeah, I would just add to Deborah's question that, you're absolutely right, Deborah, there is never the perfect partner. And one thing that I feel some pride in is that in my involvement with the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding going back to 2006, I think we kind of normalized relations for the Jewish community with the mainstream Muslim community. And there was, as you say, there was resistance to that. The Union for Reform Judaism started it, and then they didn't really follow through that well, I think. But there were other, major defense groups, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, that for 10 years held back from talking to the Islamic Society of North America. It was probably the most centrist of Muslim groups, because they said, well, yes, back in 1992, somebody related to the Muslim Brotherhood might have been on a phone call. I mean, it really, and there were people, kind of pushing this, influential people in the Jewish community. But we normalized talking not only to ISNA, but even eventually talked to CARE. We just felt that, we can agree to disagree respectfully on Israel-Palestine, but we felt this need on both sides, obviously, to make this happen, to build this relationship. And we, was very, very happy that by 2016, both the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee changed their position. And I think it was because we had many of us, and Foundation for Ethnic Understanding was only one, but there were many people who had been building these grassroots relationships, city by city around the country, bringing together Muslims and Jews. So it was kind of too big at some point for them to ignore. And I think they came around to it also because I think there is this understanding in both faiths, in both of the communities, that we really do need each other, that this is an important relationship. So that groundwork had to be done, and so I'm proud that I was part of that.
Thank you. I'm going to take a break from some of the questions that I've got to ask, because I can see that Afzal's got his hand up, and there's some questions that are in the chat. We'll come to Afzal first.
Thank you very much. I thought it was fascinating, actually, both of them sharing their journey and more recent discussion which was going on about conflict. And I thought perhaps I should now interject here as well, because of our experience of the Greater Manchester Muslim Jewish Forum, because we similarly had similar idea that this whole idea, how do we manage this? So from my own personal perspective, the first point is I find it so sad when you want to look at this relationship between the Muslim and the Jewish communities just with this conflict, because I think the relationship is far more important and far bigger than just this dispute which exists. And the second point I feel also is that this dispute, you know, is new almost, you could say. Okay, 70 years is a long time, but it's relative in the scale of history. It's new, and therefore there's no reason to assume that it'll carry on. It can get sorted out. We've got an amazing past history. And I'm not trying to say here that this was a perfect, like the rabbi said, you know, there is no perfect partners. And so there has been ups and downs. But broadly speaking, I would say that the Muslim-Jewish relationship over thousands of plus years has been pretty good, actually. And therefore, we've got to keep that in the perspective as well. And then when I've been involved with this work, and I've been attacked from both sides, and the comfort I take is being attacked from both sides, I must be doing something right. If the Muslims are also attacking me, and some of the Jewish part of the Jewish community are also attacking me, maybe I'm about the right place. But I just want to share finally with you this experience of Gaza dispute, which we then experimented, because we had this not to touch the subject, and then realized, no, you can't totally not touch it when it's there. So how do we actually handle it? And the way we handled it was actually not to ignore it, but to accept it. But we just added a little limitation. And that limitation was each one can come to the table from their own perspective. But what does it mean to me? How do I feel? And that was so powerful. Of all the events we have done, I found that the most moving, that you could actually feel that pain from both sides when this conflict was going on, the difficulty they were all going through. And then you could see this common humanity idea which actually exists despite this conflict, which is a deep conflict. So I think in that sense, what we have to work out is, but this is there, how do we manage it? And if we can learn to manage this, then we'll be able to develop on the huge areas. And that gives me the similar idea. You know, it's almost like having lots of small strings, but if you can pull them together, they can still be a very strong rope. So there's a lot there which we have together.
Thank you. And I just want to lift up something that's been mentioned in the chat by Nathan, that's an invaluable resource if you're in the UK, and that's the organisation Solutions Not Sides, who I know have been incredibly useful for those of us working particularly with young people in establishing ways of talking about the conflict when nuclei of the conflict show up in our schools and in our young people, in particular social groups. So if you missed the link, I really encourage you to go back and look for it, because in the UK it's a very practical resource for all of us. We've got a question from Councillor Heather Fletcher, who this is appropriate maybe because you've put a book out into the media space. How does the media impact these narratives? She's highlighted a couple of examples of really positive stories from the UK, the Bradford Synagogue, which is a very beautiful story of a local Muslim community repairing the roof and becoming trustees of the community, Jewish security services protecting mosques, and circles of solidarity, etc., etc. And what role does the media have in creating this climate?
Well, let's. So first of all, I think Heather is absolutely right, and that I know that, yeah, the story she's talking about, the Bradford Synagogue in particular, I visited, and it was very, very inspiring to see that, and so the challenge is to break through with those stories and to break through with into the media with the work that we're doing, generally, and with the twinnings and all that. And it remains hard, at least in our country, that it doesn't. And I'm speaking as a former, as I told you, I was a journalist for most of my life, and I, feel that the journalism that I was involved with and so many others was, it was solid, it was real, but and important and honest. That was the main thing. But there was this tendency that conflict is more interesting than peace and love, and that remains a challenge. So when we started this season, the Weekend of Twinning, back in 2008, the first year we were doing this annually, where we would bring together as many mosques and synagogues and Muslim and Jewish student groups and women's groups, and first around the US, then around the world, and including wonderful events that the Manchester Muslim Jewish Forum took part in. And I just want to say how important the work of the Manchester Muslim Jewish Forum has been. I mean, it's just been really inspirational, and I think it's been a great model that you put out there in terms of how to do this, and really, and so much fun. You all have you feel that from 3,000 miles away. Anyway, but so the first year that we did the season of Twinning, we had great media coverage. I mean, it was amazing. In almost every LA Times and Chicago Tribune, and even a very short thing in the New York Times, and on and on and on. It was great, and TV. By the second or third year, they said, no, we weren't getting covered. They were like, we already covered that last year. What's new? So you need to. It's a challenge, and continues to be. So yeah, I'm in touch with media folks all the time, and they're saying, "Oh, that's very nice, and good for you, Walter." Unfortunately, so remains a challenge. But creative ways. I mean, something like the Bradford Synagogue story is so compelling that. So part of it, I guess, is being really creative and thinking, how do we grab an angle here that really will get them to say this is a story? Because ultimately, it's about, is it in their mind, is it a story or not?
I've got a follow-up question, which is, I think, also connected to something you said before about what kind of dialogue is somewhat not useful. So you talked about Muslim groups not only speaking to anti-Zionist Jews, for instance. I want to explore this notion with you about the good Muslim and the good Jew in interfaith spaces. When somebody brings a Jew or a Muslim into a space and says, listen to this person, they agree with me. How can you model a kind of dialogue that is much less neat than that? It's a real encounter, and it's messy, but it's richer. But when we see those models in our community, here's a Jew who denounces this, here's a Muslim who denounces this, and they are in some way removed from their identity by the way they're portrayed. How can we, as people invested in deep conversations, respond to that? How do you respond to that when you see it?
Sabeeha, you.
Yeah, how do we respond to the concept that this is a good Muslim and a good Jew talking to one another? And how about the others?
Yeah, or like talking to us. So I can speak for the Jewish community. There's a particular narrative of, look, here's this Muslim who denounces Hamas and is a Zionist. There are many speaker rotations of within the Jewish community of people who, and it's one voice, but it is slightly tokenizing and potentially really problematic. I know that there are similar experiences of Jews in other communities. I'm wondering how you respond to that when you see it.
Yeah, it is a challenge because you are perceived as being unique and as not being like the rest of them kind of Muslims. And I started feeling that way early in the 70s when I was hanging out with my Orthodox Jewish neighbors, and we are exchanging notes on kosher and halal and Ramadan and Sukkot. And it was like, oh, wow, oh, wow. And that's when it occurred to me that I would very much like my Jewish neighbors to meet my Pakistani Muslim friends, because I didn't want my Jewish neighbors to believe that I was an aberration. But I also wanted my Muslim Pakistani friends to see how nice these Jewish families were, and kind of, remove that misconception that they had in their hearts and in their minds. So we started gathering informally in my home for dinner. And gradually, that is what then grew into larger groups, into larger spaces, and into public spaces. And over the decades, I and people who are involved in similar activities have continued to take this conversation not only from living rooms into public spaces, but back into living rooms. Because it's one thing to be standing on a stage with a mic in your hand and talking at a congregation. It's a whole other experience to be sitting in a living room or around a kitchen table and over a meal, getting to know one another, politics aside, so that now you're making a date for a coffee, for a walk in the park, let's go visit this exhibit at the museum, and you start seeing the person as a person rather than as a Jew or as a Christian or as a Zionist or an anti-Zionist. So we've created projects like an interfaith book club, things that bring people together into intimate spaces to dispel that notion that maybe these few people who are talking the same language are distinct and unique and an outlier. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'm a little bit time conscious as well, so I'd love us to get through both of these if we can. One asks, based on what you've learned during your journey, what do you feel are the most common misconceptions within Jewish and Muslim communities about each other's faiths?
Well, one of the misconceptions that anybody outside of the Muslim faith has about Muslims, or did have that misconception, was that Muslims were terrorists. And that is something that was the reason why my husband and I got involved in interfaith dialogue, because I did not want my children to come home after their kindergarten class from school and say, Mommy, why are people calling me a terrorist? So that was the first misconception. The other one was, why do you treat your women so badly? And we have had to deal with that in a myriad of ways, for which I won't have time to get into it. But just the fact that I'm sitting here and I'm talking with you, and Qaisra organized this, does say something about to deal with that misconception. And the third misconception we dealt with was that if Islam is really such a faith of social justice that promotes social justice, then why don't we see this in Muslim countries all over the world? And essentially what they're talking about is Sharia. And Sharia has become like a bad word, because with Sharia, you associate cutting off the hand, beheading people, stoning women. And that is another misconception that we have had to deal with and overcome. And there's a lot I can say about that, but we won't have time to get into it. But these are some of the misconceptions about us.
From my side, I think that, many Muslims that I've encountered, just like Christians and other non-Jews, but the Muslim community has certainly bought into the perception that the Jews are somehow all powerful, super wealthy, control the media and all that kind of thing. So I guess one of the things that I sort of like to do, it's a little bit of a cheap line, but I say, well, I can prove that all Jews are not rich. Look at me. I've never had I've never made a dime in my life. I've just been kind of into a journalist and community activist, and so, but that is out there. to some degree, it's also, you know, it's not a total negative because it does, it's been one of the factors, I think, that moved the Muslim community in reaching out after 9/11 to the Jewish community. Was a perception that, you know, the Jewish community could be a friend and protector and is powerful, and there is some truth to that. But what they don't, I think a lot of Muslims don't necessarily get is the sense of vulnerability that Jews have, that all of us carry, that we're just, you know, a generation or two from Auschwitz, and we too have been made to feel very, very vulnerable. You know, I mentioned the Tree of Life massacre. So we have the concurrent rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, and I think that as this movement has gone along, the understanding on both sides of the vulnerability of the other has really come forward. Might not have been the case 15 or 20 years ago. So I think those are some of them. The other one, you know, that comes up in a more of a historical context is that Muslims are rightfully very proud of, you know, the period of the middle, you know, when, let's say, Cordoba, the period of Cordoba in Spain, and in general that the Jews were treated so much better in the Islamic world, not only Cordoba, but, you know, in Cairo and Baghdad than they were in Europe, for sure. You know, there was nothing like, you know, what happened in your own country where the Jews were kicked out for 300 years, I believe, and horrible stuff beyond that. But but in that equation, it was like, oh, we were also happy together when under Muslim rule, you know, and of course under Muslim rule, the Jews were a lower, you know, on a lower level. They had to play by the rules, and it was so. You know, Cordoba is not necessarily a model for what we're doing now. We're living in multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies where we want everyone to be on the same level. We want equality and freedom of religion for all peoples. So I guess those are a few from my side.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to answer this question in 1 minute because we have 1 minute left for questions, but Barbara's asked a question and I want to make sure you answer it. She's asked, how do you deal with attacks? When people criticize you or attack your work, how do you deal with it?
I've been doing this for, you know, many years, decades, and I've been attacked for all kinds of things from all these years, and you know, it still hurts. You know, I think the common line is grow a thick skin, and I try, but it's never easy, and it brings up issues in me, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm betraying my own people somehow, and I have, you know, that's all there. But I have a deeper sense that the path I followed is the right one, and that it's made a positive difference. So I just have to go forward and, you know, take it.
Thank you, Sabeeha.
Ditto.
Thank you. That was 1 minute. I'm going to say thank you to you both for allowing us into your world and for sharing your insights with such openness and generosity of spirit. And pass over to Mohammed Amin, who's going to close for us today.
Thank you. My role is to give the vote of thanks. Before I do, I have a few comments. I got to know Walter Ruby long distance when he was at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, but we have met once in person. We had a meal together with Qaisra Shahraz and others in May of 2015 when the Muslim Jewish Forum of Greater Manchester was visiting Brussels. And Heather Fletcher, who asked a question from the audience, she was there as well. I ordered the book as soon as I knew that it was going to be published because I knew Walter personally. And although I've got hundreds of unread books, when I committed to attending this book launch, I knew I had to read it in advance. And I found it very easy to read and very personal. Both Walter and Sabeeha Rehman have been incredibly open about their lives and their personal journeys. And I think everyone will get something out of reading it. Now, I've got a long list of people who I want to thank, and I'm going to go through all of them together. And then we can show our collective appreciation, which is quite hard actually in a webinar. So let me start with Yulia Egorova from Durham University for opening the event, and Qaisra Shahraz, who organized it all, ably assisted by Mariam Afolabi and Steve Tennant, who's handled the technology. Very special thanks to our event chair, Rabbi Deborah Blawston, who stepped in at the very last minute because Rabbi Miriam Berger, who was going to do it, had to conduct a funeral, a very sad funeral. I want to thank our guest speakers from the Christian, Muslim and Jewish faiths, Reverend Nathan Eddy, who again, I'm looking forward to meeting in person because I'm an active member of the Council of Christians and Jews, and I normally attend the AGM if I'm in London when it happens. Most of all, I want to thank the co-authors, Walter Ruby and Sabeeha Rehman, for sharing their personal experiences with us, and also for getting up at a really ungodly hour in the USA to fit in with our diaries here in the UK. And finally, my thanks to you, the audience, because without you, it wouldn't have been much of an event. Now, because this is a webinar, nobody can hear you clap, but you can post comments in the chat about how you feel, and I will give a wave as my congratulations to thank everybody. So now let me hand back to Yulia Egorova to officially close the event.
Thank you very much indeed, Amin, and again, a very, very big thank you to Qaisra and all the organizers of MACFEST. This was indeed a tremendously important and interesting discussion. I feel very, very privileged to have been included in the event. Having read the book, here, let me please show it again. It was truly amazing to hear the stories of Sabeeha and Walter and the stories of their involvement in different initiatives of Jewish-Muslim dialogue, really tremendously important and significant initiatives in their own voices. I would like to thank our audience again, and also to please draw their attention to the slide that we can all see in front of us. Saying that the next meeting of the Muslim Arts and Culture Festival is going to take place on the 5th of February in the new calendar year, and I'm very much looking forward to attending it myself. Thanks a lot. Again, it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I hope that we all will continue the conversations that Sabeeha and Walter have started today going in our own fora and initiatives. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to host you both, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
Sunday.
Bye.
Hi, everybody.
Bye.
Take
Thank you,
care.
everyone.
Bye.